today's news.
Hello and welcome to Old News, the programme and podcast which looks at news stories of the day through the papers of yesterday. This week, LegCo, the Legislative Council, been back in the news quite recently as there are applications currently open, I think, for the next round of seats on LegCo. And for the first time, people can put their names forward directly, not be nominated by an MHK, perhaps a step towards a slightly different version of LegCo. I had a rummage back to see what they've been up to over the last 100 years or so. And I do mean 100 years or so. I'll go back to 1898 to start the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, April the 23rd of that year. The Legislative Council met, we read in the Isle of Man Times, on Thursday, all the members being present except the Clerk of the Rolls. The Merchandise Marks Bill, which is intended to assimilate the law in the Isle of Man to that of England, was considered on second reading. The committee, consisting of Deemsters Gale and Gill and the Attorney General, brought up the bill as recast, and it was considered clause by clause and passed with verbal amendments. The chief alterations in this bill were to discard the clauses introduced by the Keys dealing with the covering of goods. The Keys amendments to the Education Bill were next discussed. The Keys proposed that schools should be available for all public purposes when required upon the authority of the captain of the parish. The Council unanimously rejected this provision on the grounds that it was improper to take the schools out of the hands of the committee and that damage was sometimes done to school furniture by public meetings being held in the schools. You'd have thought the children would have been good enough at damaging the furniture themselves. Another new section proposed by the Keys with regard to the joint management of schools by the committees of neighbouring districts was also rejected as being unnecessary and unintelligible. Oh, dear me. We skip forward to 1903 in the Isle of Man Examiner, Saturday, April the 11th. The Legislative Council met in the Council Chamber at Douglas on Tuesday. There were present the Deputy Governor, the Attorney General, the Receiver General and the Vicar General. The Clerk to the Council, Mr Herbert Story, also in attendance. They looked at the Valuation Bill. The schedule of the Valuation Bill, as revised by the Attorney General and Mr Story, was agreed to. The Attorney General said it was desirable that the measure should be more uniform, but the bill was such that a vast improvement on the present method that he did not think they should postpone it for the cause of uniformity. The bill, as amended, was sent to the House of Keys. They also, on this occasion, considered quick legislation, public notices bill, the result of the loss of the Patrick Church Bill, and there was a suspension of standing orders. In the Examiner of Saturday, October the 31st, Hop Junet, 1908, under a title, Insular Legislature, Legislative Council. The Legislative Council met in the Council Chamber, Legislative Buildings, Douglas, on Tuesday. There were present the Lieutenant Governor, the Clerk of the Rolls, Deemster Moore, Deemster Callow, the Attorney General, the Vicar General, the Receiver General and the Archdeacon. A slightly different makeup, perhaps, to today's Legislative Council. The Higher Education Act, Amendment Bill already necessary. Supplementary education in elementary schools. The Attorney General moved the suspension of the standing orders with a view to proceeding with the consideration of a bill to amend the Higher Education Act 1907. The motion was agreed to. The first reading of the bill was then passed on the motion of the Attorney General. The AG moved the second reading of the bill, which he said was a very short one indeed and was really more machinery than anything else. Under the Higher Education Act 1907, it was found impractical to provide higher education through the instrumentality of the existing boards. The funds under the Higher Education Act were confined exclusively, of course, to the works of higher education and were not to be devoted to the purposes of elementary education at all. Under the Act as passed, it became exceedingly difficult to use the existing machinery under the Elementary Education Acts, are you keeping up, and at the same time to keep perfectly separate and distinct the funds. This bill, by the second clause, conferred power upon the Higher Education Board in addition to the powers already existing under the Act of 1907 to make arrangements with the school boards of their district for the supply by those boards or in connection with public elementary schools of instruction supplementary to that given in those schools under the Elementary Education Act 1893 to 1903. To 1920 in the Peel City Guardian, Saturday, December the 11th. Public Markets Weighing of Cattle Bill. Notice is hereby given, we read, that the committee appointed by the Legislative Council on the 7th of December 1920 will sit in the chamber of the Legislative Council, Legislative Buildings, Douglas, at 11 a.m. on Friday the 17th of December 1920 to hear evidence in support or opposition to the Public Markets Weighing of Cattle Bill. All persons interested, and who wouldn't be, are invited to attend. Signed B.E. Sargent, I think that is S-A-R-G-E-A-U-N-T. Sargent, I believe it is, although a slightly alternative spelling. The Government Secretary of the time, the 9th of December 1920. A decade further forward, 1930, in the Mona's Herald, Wednesday, February the 26th. Legislative Council Rents Bill passed. The Legislative Council met in the Council chamber yesterday, His Excellency the Lieutenant Governor presiding. The Local Government Amendment Bill 1930 was read for the first time. The object of the bill is to enlarge the powers of village and parish commissioners under the Local Governments Act by extending the acts to all districts in respect of the matters which might be exercised in the parishes and villages as well as in the towns. Under the bill, the local authorities have power to make provision for recreation grounds, deal with obstructions in thoroughfares, and to make provision for gas and water. The Council next dealt with the Public Authorities Acquisition of Land Amendment Bill 1930. The bill makes provision for the purchase of land by public authorities and deals with methods of ascertaining the compensation. It also proposes to reduce the period within which a party claiming an interest in land required by a public authority is to receive notice to treat for the purchase of the land and to give particulars to the authority from 21 days to 7 days. The bill was read a first time. Also, interestingly, the Seagull Preservation Amendment Bill was read a first, second and third time and passed. Now, the object of this bill, the Attorney General said, is to enable the Governor to authorise certain licensed persons to take the eggs of the herring gull during the limited period of each year. The bill was introduced with the concurrence of the Fishery Board, who are of the opinion that the excessive number of herring gulls led to the destruction of fish, especially freshwater fish. Really? And acted prejudicially to other bird life. It was proposed under the bill to give certain persons power to reduce the number of gulls by taking their eggs to an extent authorised. The Governor said that he had tried to make the scheme a remunerative one, but he did not think that probable, although it would be self-supporting as there was not a single egg desiccating factory in Europe. He did, however, think that the licensees would be able to sell the eggs locally for confectionery and so on. Icing made with a herring gull egg, anyone? The Receiver General said that he knew that gulls took a large number of the trout from the rivers which had been stocked by the Fisheries Board. Goodness me, I don't know whether I'd want confectionery made with a herring gull egg. And of course, herring gulls now, I believe, on the red list. Their numbers have plummeted somewhat. And then finally to 1957 in the Mona's Herald, Tuesday, December the 3rd. Constitutional reform. Just proves how long this has been debated, really, doesn't it? The MacDonald Commission and Legislative Council. His Honour Ramsay G. Johnson continues his observations on the Legislative Council in the following article, the fourth in the series on constitutional reform, and he's writing specially for the Mona's Herald. The constitution of the Legislative Council, we read, and the presence of the Deemsters in the legislature were raised last year during the general election of the House of Keys. The Labour Party, in their general election programme, asked for a complete reform of the Legislative Council. One of the candidates for Ramsay, in urging that a majority of the Legislative Council should be democratically elected, said that a commission was appointed to inquire into the subject in 1910 and that nothing had been done. He was wrong in saying this. The MacDonald Commission, after making an exhaustive examination of the whole question, made recommendations in regard to the constitution of the council and the presence of the Deemsters in it, and these recommendations were adopted by the Home Secretary. Then it goes on to say, Mr. Carruth said that in the House of Keys there were two main views on the reform of the council. The majority considered that the council should be elected by the vote of the people, and the minority considered that the council should be elected by the House of Keys and from the House of Keys. He admitted that in addition to these two groups, there was a very small group that held the view that the council should be elected by the House of Keys, but not necessarily from the House of Keys. Well, where have we heard that before? Isn't that amazing to think 1957, a mere 70-odd years ago, they were debating it. And are we still debating the setup of the Legislative Council these days? Its constitution and the like? I believe we are. Wheels turn slowly in certain circles, it seems, particularly within government circles at times. Just goes to prove the Legislative Council, like so many other topics, is old news. Until next week, cheerio.
You're gonna be yesterday's news.